Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a tag video. This was originated by Mark over at Book Time with Elvis, and this is called the Interstroke Eurorail Book Tag Part 1. And I'll post the link to Mark's video. So I'm old enough where I did actually Interrail and Trans-Euro Express, because Interrail was limited to 1 month's unlimited travel anywhere on the network that was signed up within Europe. So, for example, you couldn't travel to Tirana in Albania, but you could only have it for 1 month. So in my gap year, me and 3 schoolmates, we planned a month's worth of journey on Trans-Euro Express, which was a fixed route that we pre-selected. And then we had much more freedom, as I say, in the second month on Eurorail, on Interrail, sorry. And the first stop, we travelled from London via Paris to Venice. Venice was our first booked stop, so I think we slept on the train, or tried to sleep on the train, because it was a day's journey. But when we got to Venice, our youth hostel didn't have our booking, or they double booked or whatever. So we had to find somewhere to stay, and we found this really nice room, but it was very expensive because it's Venice, and we blew most of our budget on the first night. And this was a repeated theme of our travel in Europe, of youth hostels closed down because of poor behaviour by the guy running it. Youth hostels that didn't have our bookings, and by the time we reached Yugoslavia, which was still one unified state then, we just basically adopted the tactic of travel by night, which is all you could do on the rail system in Yugoslavia pretty much anyway, and sleeping, getting interrupted by very officious guys wanting to see your passport and your tickets, and arriving in each new city at about 6 a.m. in the morning and spending the day doing the tourist bit, and then getting back on a train to sleep on our way to our next destination. So I think we actually were in Zagreb twice and Belgrade twice, just because that's the only way we could make it work. But it was a great experience. Okay, so on with the actual tag itself. You begin your journey in London, which is handy for me as a Londoner. Dr. Johnson said, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford." Hard to afford anything in London these days, least of all a house. What book can you read, reread, and read again and again throughout your life? Well, throughout my life, I only discovered this about 3 years ago, which is This Is Not a Novel and Other Novels by David Markson. I've talked ad infinitum about it. I'm not going to talk about it here, other than to say there are 3 novels in here, all quite similar in style. But what Markson does is he's quoting other people throughout history, be it journal entries or things they've actually said and stuff. So actually it's a really good sort of compendium of the history of human thought, really. That's why I can reread it and reread it, in addition to appreciating the sheer subversiveness on what it means, what he means by fiction, what we mean by a novel. So Sherlock Holmes lived, inverted commas, at 221B Baker Street. Have you ever visited the home of an imaginary character, and if so, whose? Yes, in my mind I have been present at Kafka's castle and Kafka's trial. Harris asked me if I'd ever been in the maze at Hampton Court, which is a quote from Jerome K Jerome. Have you ever been lost in a book, and not in a good way? Did you completely lose the plot and not have the slightest idea of what was going on? Please give an example. Yes, Joseph McElroy's Ancient History, a paraphrase, which doesn't even, the word paraphrase doesn't even mean anything. It seemed to be a book about plotting relationships by the physical proximity of characters as they moved in and out of houses. I was completely lost. I can't say I lost the plot because A, there's no plot, and B, I never had it in the first place. You head to St Pancras and board the Eurostar to Paris. And within a couple of hours you arrive at the Gare du Nord. The Père Lachaise Cemetery is on your itinerary. Have you been there, or have you ever made a pilgrimage to any literary site? I haven't been to Père Lachaise because to me I associate it with Jim Morrison of the Doors, and who wants that? But I have made a pilgrimage to another cemetery, a much more literary cemetery, I believe, in Paris, called the Montparnasse Cemetery, which houses many, many writers. such as Samuel Beckett, for example. And the last time I was in Paris, I'd been invited to do an event at Columbia University's base out there, their summer school, and that was great. And I got paid, and I think that's the most I've ever earned as a writer in one hit. And so I had basically 2/3 of the next day after the event free to myself. And so I went to Montparnasse and I spent probably 3 hours there for reasons I'll come back to. So the first thing to say is I filmed it and I uploaded it, I mean an edited version, not the full 3 hours. And I edited a version which you can see my increasing frustration because I couldn't find Beckett. It turns out that the first name on the grave is his wife's, and Beckett is a sort of sub entry on the grave. So that was the first thing. But I was actually looking for the grave of this guy called Soutine, who was a French-Jewish painter who spent most of the war in Paris and other parts of France possibly, trying to avoid the Nazis and basically starving to death. And in the end, they caught him right at the end of the war and killed him. So I couldn't find Soutine's grave either. I really struck out. It's quite a fun video because you can see my mounting frustration. And as I say, I'll post the link. What are some of the best historical sites you've visited? Well, easily the best for me is the old city is Split, which is in Croatia, because it's the palace of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. And when the Romans vacated the city, the locals moved in and they turned the corridors into roads and the rooms into houses. And it won't take you very long to walk around the old city, maybe a morning. But, there's just so many surprising things, like sort of Roman eagles coming out of somebody's front wall and stuff like that. It's an extraordinary place. Absolutely lovely. Gertrude Stein famously said, "America is my country and Paris is my hometown. What is your country? What town other than your own have you felt at home in?" Well, I've always, like Samuel Johnson, I've only ever really lived in London and would only want to live in London. The only time I lived outside was when I was at university. But that is starting to erode. It started with Brexit, even though London actually held firm and first of all had no truck with UKIP. I mean, UKIP got no traction in London at all and voted unanimously to remain. But it became clear during that vote that we were hated by the rest of the country, who viewed it as that we got all the goodies that were handed out by government, all the subsidies for arts and things like that. And I was unaware that we were so hated. And my reflexive action was, okay, well, go screw yourselves, the rest of England. We'll become a city-state like ancient Athens. And we'll hook up back with the EU. That suits us fine. We'll keep the narrow corridor down to Brighton on the coast because, after all, Brighton is London by the sea. But it was devastating, that whole, because it wasn't just about the EU. It was about the state of relationships within Britain. And since then, as we've had things like, COVID and the anti-vaxxers and the protesters, I don't recognise my own city anymore. I will say that it's been a Labour city ever since sort of Tony Blair, really. Even after Blair, and you've had sort of pretty much non-stop Conservative rule, London has always remained Labour, which is very odd because London is a very, very expensive city. It's a very middle-class city because of that, because no one else can afford to live here. So you would actually think it would be sort of the realm of the capitalists and the Conservatives, but actually it's a sort of reasonably patronising middle-class Labour vote, and that's partly why we're hated by Labour supporters in the north, where they don't have the privileges and the wealth that we have, and it's why Labour will never win another election, because it's split between its metropolitan city base and its old traditional working class base, and never the twain shall meet. So it's the other thing about sort of recent sort of electoral history is that Jeremy Corbyn fought 2 elections, one when he had just become leader, and there's this whole movement behind him of the young, and it's very sort of football chanty, singing of his name and stuff, and that's when he did well and almost surprised people with how well he did. And then the last election was because he'd shown no leadership in the Brexit thing. Labour's position was horribly muddled and got absolutely wiped out in the north because all the Brexiteers, working class Brexiteer votes, were furious with Corbyn. Just as much as his metropolitan voters were furious because he hadn't been strong enough on Remain. But anyway, and it strikes me that the type of Labour voter in London, they don't like to be associated with losers and losing causes. So I think London will start to have a bit more conservative stronghold than it currently is, where they're really relegated to just the marginal suburban, very rich boroughs of London. I think that will change. I think another reason why Labour is doomed, because I would imagine that a good quarter of its total sitting MPs are in London seats, and as I say, I think that will diminish. So as an alternative city I'd like to live in, well, I have no experience of it. I mean, when I went to Prague just after it sort of the Velvet Revolution and had started to open up, I really liked it. I really got a good feel about it, even though it was quite clear that it was already being sort of, completely capitalised by Germans and Americans. And the point is, I don't know what it's like now in 2021. It must have changed since then. So whether I'd still get such a good feeling about it or not, I don't know. But Prague, in some sort of fantasy way, I imagine I could live there, although obviously I don't speak Czech. Amsterdam is a city I haven't visited since I was a child, but the Dutch seem to be very on it when it comes to sort of environmentalism and a general, they're not as materialistic as the British. But again, it's sort of fantasy, because I don't really know what these places are like. Cafes are everywhere in Paris. I like to sit in one for even a couple of hours, skimming through a book and people watching. If you've been to Paris, which I have, where is your favourite place to visit and the favourite thing to do there? Well, my favourite thing to do there is the art galleries too. But the problem is, in all the years that I've been going, my two favourites have both been sort of upgraded and moved to their detriment, I feel. So the first was the Jeu de Paume, which was the Impressionist, dedicated to the Impressionists. It was in the Tuileries? It was in a corner of either the Tuileries or the Luxembourg Gardens. I can't remember now. And all that stuff obviously has been moved into the Orsay Museum. So you have to plough your way through so much art from other periods to find the modern art section, which is kind of a pain. And the other is the Museum of Oriental Art, which moved into the 7th arrondissement, so it's actually really easy to visit the last time I was there. Not when I was there for the gig. Previous time I'd gone with my wife on the Eurostar. And because we were staying in the 7th arrondissement. But the problem was, my favourite exhibit floor in the old one was where a lot of the stolen friezes and statues from the Angkor Wat Temple in Cambodia, which of course was a French colony, and had been sort of totally overtaken by the jungle after it was abandoned. And a French explorer was the guy who rediscovered it, and they cut back the jungle and stuff. But it's just been absolutely rinsed for its friezes and, as I say, its statues, which is morally deplorable. But for all that, I found the room where a lot of this was on display, which was in really low lighting, and the Buddhist statues were sitting on the floor. It's just so powerful. It's the one time I felt genuinely in the presence of a spiritual atmosphere. It was extraordinary. And when me and my wife went back to the new housing of that museum, they said that floor was closed. But I suspect actually that it's not on exhibit anymore, because probably the moral iniquities of having basically ripped this art off the original location, a bit like the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. But I'm guessing, but I think the French are maybe behaving more honourably and more morally than the British. If you haven't been to Paris, which I have, would you like to? I'd like to go back, pandemic allowing. And what would you most like to see and do there? That seems to be the same question. But anyway, I'd like to man the barricades of the 21st century Commune. because there's no chance of that happening in Britain. But France seems to do it periodically. Although the last lot, unfortunately, was the yellow gilets, the yellow jackets, which was a rather reactionary radical revolution. But assuming the French find their true soul, which is, I think, a sort of a left-leaning soul, they'll throw up another Commune barricades in Paris at some point. I say this not entirely seriously, because, of course, people die in revolutions. After a few days of eating pain au chocolat and drinking one too many café au laits, neither of which I do, by the way, you decide to head south. You head to the Gare du Nord and board the train to Madrid. It will take you 11 hours and 26 minutes, and you will travel 654 miles, which is 1,052 kilometres. What is the longest train journey you've ever taken? Well, for our Interrail, we ended up in Salzburg, and we had 2 days left of the ticket, and so we knew we had to get back to Paris in order to get the train to the French coast, and then the ferry, as was then, because it was long before the Eurotunnel, back to London. And we wanted a day in Paris because we hadn't toured it, and also it's a chance to sort of buy presents for our family, that sort of thing. And so we decided to take the train from Salzburg to Paris, which is 988 kilometres, and took us over a day. I can't remember exactly. And I remember it was so hot, and going through Germany just seemed to be endless. And we were in a carriage with some Swedish backpackers, and they seemed to find us very unsanitary. They were very fastidious about cleanliness and stuff. We'd been taught backpacking for two weeks, sleeping on 2 months, sleeping on trains, sleeping on roofs in Athens and things like that. So yeah, it was a difficult journey, to say the least. But the shortest train journey we took during that 2 months tour was actually the most unpleasant, which was from Athens to Piraeus, where we were going to catch a ferry to Brindisi in Italy. And they packed us in cattle trucks. And Athens is one of the hottest European cities there is. And it was so deeply unpleasant. And, in a way, it sort of brought to my mind of the cattle trucks that the Jews were transporting in the Holocaust. And I don't know how long our journey lasted, maybe an hour. But if you consider the journeys that the Jews were forced onto these trains and how long they lasted, no water, people dying in there, just, so the dead were with the living. I mean, I'm not making any comparisons, but I imagine in our so-called civilized world, that's the closest I get to even having a smidgen of what it might have been like. In the same way as when I visited Alcatraz in the 80s sometimes, and they shut us in the cells and there was no light. So again, just for a very brief window, you get an idea of what it would be like, but you don't get the sense of the remorselessness of it through a day. Have you a favourite book or film set on trains? I don't have a favourite book set on a train, but my favourite film scene is the opening to the 1971 Michael Caine version of Get Carter. Please do not confuse this with the horrendous abomination that was the Sylvester Stallone remake. And Michael Caine is a London gangster who is returning to Newcastle, where supposedly he's from, even though he has a London accent, and the Newcastle accent is so radically different, but we'll ignore that. And he's going back up there because he's heard his brother has died, and he's going up there to basically find the circumstances and bring the killers to gangster justice. And it's a brilliant, it's done over the opening credits, and you just get this sense of what a foreign, even though it's within Britain, obviously, but what a foreign territory that he's entering from London. There's a scene where he sort of sniffs amphetamines in the train toilet, and he's also reading Farewell My Lovely, Philip Marlowe detective novel. So it's just and the thing that absolutely makes it is the music. So the music to the original Get Carter is stupendous. Some of the best film music, especially composed for a film, you will ever hear. Very sort of jazzy, and it plays throughout this opening scene on the train. There's no dialogue really, and it's just fantastic. And I will post the link because YouTube's got a 3-minute clip of the entire opening to that film. It's just wonderful. You are lucky that you can ride in comfort through France and over the Pyrenees into Spain. unlike Captain Jack Aubrey, post-captain, I don't know what this is a reference to, but anyway, who had to don a bear suit and answer to the name of Flora to cross the mountains. Have you got a favourite book featuring a manhunt and or subterfuge? Yeah, I mean, I'm not really into sort of chase scenes, either in films or in books, but what I did enjoy was Rogue Mail by Geoffrey Household, which is a book written in 1939, where an assassin is going to kill some sort of political leader or ruler, and it all goes horribly wrong, and he has to go on the run. And he makes his way back to Britain, but there are still people pursuing him. And basically, as a hunter, he has now become the hunted, and it's very much animalistic in that he sort of is living literally on the ground or even under the ground in places that he's stripped of everything. It's really well done. The Spanish national anthem famously does not have any words. If you have seen them singing at football matches, they are really just humming along to a tune, which I did not know, in fact. What is your favourite instrumental-only piece of music? Are you prone to whistling? Yeah, I am prone to whistling, but only when listening to music, not sort of just in the streets and stuff. Instrumental, oh God, so much. I love dub reggaes where there isn't really lyrics, maybe a snatch of sampled lyric. I love instrumental versions of hip hop records, but an actual specific instrumentalist tune. Yeah, I might have to come back to that. I haven't got one off the top of my head. Cronus / Saturn devouring his son by Francisco Goya is, to my mind, one of the most disturbing paintings I have seen. You can see it too if you visit the Prado Museum in Madrid. What is one of the most disturbing books and or paintings you have seen? I don't find books disturbing because they're fiction, and I'm able to remind myself of that. But a painting that disturbs me, although I don't know if I've ever seen it in the flesh, but it's a very, it's all over the internet as an image, and it's used outside of fine art as an image, and that's Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. So, there's a whole rich tradition of incubi and succubuses as sort of stealing the sort of sexual essences and fluids of people while they're asleep. And this is the sense of being ridden by a nightmare. There's this horrible sort of imp-like creature that is sat on the stomach of a sleeping woman who's not comfortably asleep. She's sort of half fallen out of the bed as if she's been killed. Now, yes, there's that sense of the nightmares, literally a horse riding you and draining you. But this is not sexual, or not overtly sexual, because the imp is squatting on her stomach. So it's much more about suffocation and squeezing the very breath, the very life out of this woman, which I find much more disturbing than incubi and succubi, because they are sort of embodiments of wet dreams and prohibitions for the Catholic Church and stuff like that. This is about suffocation and how nightmares can absolutely terrify you. So yeah, I find that and I'll post the picture. I don't know how clear it will be. Watching Kronos having his dinner has given you an appetite, so you repair to a restaurant to try Spain's national dish, the paella. If I were to visit your hometown, what restaurant would you take me to, and what would be the dish you would most recommend? Okay, so Britain, basically, it's sort of indigenous cooking, such as it is pretty horrible. But fortunately, we're blessed with many migrants coming into our country from our former colonies and bringing their wonderful cuisine traditions with them. And my favourite of all is South Indian vegetarian food. And in London, there's this one street called Drummond Street, which is near sort of between King's Cross and Euston. And it has 3 Southern Indian, what are called Belpuri houses, Ravi Shankar's chutneys, and I think the third one are called Dewana. And Southern Indian, it's very much kind of street food. So I always have to start with a dish called Belpuri, which it's just an explosion of tastes and textures. It's wonderful. It has sort of fried puff pastry, it has coriander, it has lemon juice, it has this amazing sauce, which is a chutney of some sort. It has potatoes. It's just all these different, as I say, tastes and textures. So that's what you have as a starter. And then you have a dosa, which is filled with all sorts of different things that you can choose. A dosa is like a sort of a wrapped pancake, and it's served with a coconut chutney and a sambal, which is quite a spicy, very liquid sauce. I don't have the sambal, I just have the coconut. I would take people there, and in fact, I have taken Celia and Elizabeth of Bookish North, booktubers, to that restaurant. I also taken Jason and Neil Griffiths, who no longer records videos, unfortunately, but I took them both there as well when Jason was over. And I would take anyone over, but I have to be aware that not everyone's used to sort of Indian spice, so something I take as very mild isn't necessarily mild to someone who is not used to eating that sort of food, but that would be my first place of choice. We will pause on our journey for now, but if you've enjoyed it up to now, we will continue in the future. So thank you very much to Mark. I am going to, he doesn't say anything about tagging people, but I am going to tag. I'm going to tag the aforementioned fellow travellers, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and I'll extend it to Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading, since they are married, and also to Celia and Elizabeth at Bookish North. Okay, so thanks very much, BookTube. Till next time.